and welcome to the Corridor Identification and Development Program Notice of Solicitation and Funding Opportunity webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to take you through the items you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you have problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure you are not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you're using a web browser to view the webinar, exit the webinar, download the Adobe Connect desktop application, and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. In the Troubleshooting Tips pod at the bottom left of your dashboard are some internet, network, video, and audio troubleshooting steps to ensure that participants can both hear and see the presentation. Next, the Troubleshooting Tips pod is the Web Links pod, which contains links to useful resources related to the Fed State Partnership Program. To view the web links, double-click the title of the link. At the bottom right of the Adobe Connect dashboard is a Technical Support pod. This is where you can ask our support team questions about technical issues you are having. Above the Technical Support pod is the Questions for Presenters pod for the question and answer session. This is where you can ask questions that will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Thank you to all of you who submitted pre-webinar questions. Please note that a recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to FRA's website in about a week. The presentation file will be available about 24 hours from now. Before the presentation begins, I would like to review the webinar format. We will start with a brief welcome and then launch into the presentation. Following the presentation portion of the webinar, we will have a question and answer session during which FRA will address your pre-webinar questions and those posted in the Questions for Presenters pod. Presenting in today's webinar are Wynn Davis, Senior Advisor for Regional Outreach, Peter Schwartz, Acting Director of the Office of Railroad Planning and Engineering, Deborah Coburn, Transportation Industry Analyst with the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division, and Jenny Zhang, Transportation Industry Analyst with the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division. Our webinar today will begin with Wynn Davis and Peter Schwartz providing an overview of the Corridor Identification and Development Program, followed by Jenny Zhang and Deborah Coburn providing information on how to apply and some best practices to follow when applying. Our presenters today will conclude the webinar with a question and answer session where you can ask questions about the program and how to apply. And now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Wynn Davis, the Senior Advisor for Regional Outreach.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So before we get started, wanted to let the group know that a lot of the information we are presenting today builds upon our previous webinar that we gave on September 27th, 2022. So a lot of the questions that we've received that get into the details of step 1 and step 2 of the program are addressed in that webinar. So please, if you have not listen to that webinar, please do. There's a lot of great information there, and we're trying not to duplicate that information in this session. So let's do a quick timeline of Corridor ID. Corridor ID was established with the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law. 180 days later, we established Corridor ID, and then in December of last year, we published a notice for solicitation and funding opportunity for Corridor ID. Our next major milestone is we owe Congress our first congressional report a year after the establishment of the program. Since you heard from us in September, we have conducted pretty extensive outreach to existing corridor sponsors and potential corridor sponsors across the spectrum. And then we are kicking off at the beginning of this year, extensive outreach to Class 1 railroads related to all of our funding programs, but with a focus on the expansion and improvement of passenger rail. Sorry. Okay, so what's next? We intend to make selections into Corridor ID in late summer of this year, followed by selections under the Fed-State Partnership program. And from the date of announcement through next spring, we will be working with selected corridor sponsors to complete step 1 and begin step 2 of the program. And then we owe our next congressional report to Congress in February of 2024. Okay, so on May 13th, we also published a notice for expressions of interest in the Federal Register. We had a lot of really great support, a lot of expressions of interest. Over 100 different distinct corridors were represented of those corridors. So hearkening back to our previous webinar, here are the types of corridors we expect to see enter into Corridor ID. There were about 28 different existing corridors represented, another 13 extensions of existing corridors, and 70 entirely new corridors represented. So same information on the next slide here, presented on a map. Dotted line means that there was no route identified in the expression of interest. There may be a route there, but it wasn't actually identified. But here's a good, map of what we've seen come in under the EOI. Okay, so here are our rail development goals that we at FRA have developed after the bipartisan infrastructure law. Corridor ID really sets the foundational framework for 3 of those 5 overarching goals. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Schwartz to talk a little bit about what we're doing under Corridor ID.
Thanks so much, Wynn. So, as Wynn said, the Corridor ID program really is intended to be, going forward, the foundation for all intercity passenger rail development in the country off of the Northeast Corridor spine. And I want to stress as well that the focus of this program, as with all of FRA's railroad development efforts as it relates to passenger rail, are focused on intercity passenger rail rather than commuter rail service. That is a question that has come up in some of the pre-webinar questions. So what are we actually doing under this program? So first off, as Wynn mentioned, we have solicited proposals for improving existing or implementing new intercity passenger rail services. We do intend for the solicitation that we put out in December to be the first of regular periodic solicitations. This is not a one or done type of thing. So if you don't think you're ready to apply this time or are not selected in this round, we anticipate there will be future opportunities. We'll then be selecting corridors for development under the program. We'll be partnering with the corridor sponsor, with the applicant, to prepare or update a service development plan. That's really the core element of the program that was spelled out by Congress in the statute. The service development plan will include many things, but one key component will be a corridor project inventory, essentially a listing of projects necessary to either implement a new service or to effectuate some specific improvements to an existing service. We'll then be taking those projects from the individual corridor project inventories and following their further development during project development, which is preliminary engineering and NEPA. Those will be compiled into a program-wide Corridor ID project pipeline, which really is the culmination of the entire program. A list of projects ready for implementation, ready for final design and construction, that are prioritized and that in turn would receive priority by statute for funding under the national portion of the Fed-State Partnership Program. In addition to that priority, they would be certainly eligible for FRA's other financial assistance programs, for other department-wide programs like the MEGA program or our credit programs. But the idea really is to give much more of a framework for future funding decisions for intercity passenger rail development projects. And as part of today, we're really going to focus on the second and third steps that I just outlined, really intending to give a preview for those who are looking to apply for the program of what will happen, following selection. So in establishing the program, we had several fairly significant policy positions that we incorporated. One, as I mentioned before, is that it will be the primary mechanism for developing off Northeast Corridor intercity passenger rail services and projects. Second is that we want it to be a big tent with eligibility for all types of intercity passenger rail corridors, regardless of their scale or scope. So everything from very modest improvements to existing services all the way up to greenfield high-speed rail proposals. As I mentioned before, we intend to regularly and periodically solicit proposals for additional corridors. I think given that this first round is going to be kind of setting the foundation for everything going forward, the interval between this first round and the second round may be a little bit longer than what we'll have going forward, but in the long term, we anticipate we'd have an annual solicitation process. We also wanted to make sure that we allowed for the level of non-federal commitment for corridors to be modest at first, trying to make sure that we had as low a barrier to entry as possible, where the corridor itself seems to have a lot of promise, but maybe not a lot of development work has gone on yet. But we anticipate that that level of commitment will grow over time, bolstered by the development work done on the corridor as part of its selection and development in the program. And, lastly, and I kind of hinted at this before, in that culmination of the entire program, that corridor ID project pipeline, we want those projects to be ready for immediate implementation, ready for a decision to fund final design and construction without any intermediate gap. And that's why we have incorporated the project development phase, which we'll look at in just a second in the next slide, into the corridor ID program. So this slide really situates corridor ID and our other programs within the project lifecycle that we published in the Railroad Capital Project Guidance about a little over a month ago. So as I mentioned before, corridor ID really encompasses these development stages for intercity passenger rail corridors. Project planning and project development, with project development coinciding with the completion of preliminary engineering and environmental review. We then have other programs that have much more of an emphasis on the implementation stages of final design and construction, with a bit of overlapping eligibility into those development stages, particularly Fed State Partnership, CRISI, and some of the other DOT-wide programs. But we really believe that going forward, if you're interested in developing a intercity passenger rail service or improving the existing one, it's going to be corridor ID rather than Fed State, rather than CRISI, that are going to be the most opportune avenue for you to pursue. And we've structured things with some features like the non-federal match requirements that are actually much more advantageous to a corridor sponsor than we have under those other programs when it comes to project planning and project development. And then we also have our Restorations and Enhancement Grant Program, which allows for that startup financial assistance for operations for new or enhanced intercity passenger rail services.
So we're really viewing this year of selection into corridor ID as our baseline year. We're hoping to really capture a lot of the existing activity, harkening back to our previous webinar. We will meet you where you are in the planning cycle, so that the selections made and the map that is a result of our selection really illustrates our plan for passenger rail development across the country for new and existing corridors. Our goal is also to, as quickly as possible, align the two programs. Corridor ID is able to produce that project pipeline that Peter mentioned earlier for the Fed State Partnership National Program, so that in future funding cycles, projects that are included in the project pipeline receive that statutory priority funding look under Fed State Partnership National. So what does this mean for the different types of corridors? We've talked about this before, but we're going to spend a little more time today trying to add some meat to the bones of this concept of service development planning. So under a corridor ID, you will be required, corridor sponsors will be required to partner with FRA to undertake this process called service development planning. And really what you are planning to undertake, what your plans are for your respective corridor, really does define the level of effort associated with that service development planning. So for existing corridors, we envision a pretty low level of effort. And for the improvements to existing corridors, including trip time reductions, increased frequencies, service extensions, a more modest level of effort increasing as the whatever you're proposing, the complexity increases. And then, of course, under existing new services, either on existing or new rail lines, a pretty high level of effort where you'll be expected to undertake the full spectrum of service development planning.
So let's start kind of digging into the nitty-gritty of what's involved in preparing a service development plan. Under our program, the first step one for selected corridors will be essentially to scope out what's needed to prepare a service development plan based on the scale of the selected corridor and kind of the complexity of it, and also taking into account any work that has been done to date that could be incorporated into the service development plan that's prepared under the Corridor ID program. So, what's in here? So you start off with the corridor sponsor in partnership with FRA, defining what the service really is intended to be and what purpose it's intended to fulfill in the overall transportation system. Part of that is, defining some clear goals for that new and improved service. We then move on to identifying and engaging with the stakeholders that are going to be key to actually preparing the service development plan, providing input, providing ideas, including host railroads as applicable, and the potential operator for the service, particularly where it is an existing service. We then will look at what the alternatives may be to achieve the goals for the service, and determine which of those alternatives really make sense to pursue, and narrow things down to a clear path forward when it comes to the substance of the corridor. We'll then look at what capital improvements would be required or other investments to implement an alternative, figure out how much they cost and the sequencing of implementing those, figure out how we actually pay for it. And then lastly, look at some of the governance issues involved in implementing and operating intercity passenger rail service. Who is in charge of what and when? Realizing that these roles and responsibilities may vary or evolve as a corridor is implemented and operated, where you might have certain entities involved in the initial development, other entities getting on board or with a baton being passed to them when things enter into project development, and similarly onwards into final design, construction, and operation. So, let's look at all of the elements that really come into play in preparing a service development plan. It really all starts with what is a purpose and need statement. There was a time at FRA where we delineated between kind of the goals and objectives that we use within the transportation planning context and those that we spell out within the environmental review context. But we have decided essentially to remove that fig leaf and call purpose and need in both contexts. And we end up with a service development plan. That's the end result here. But to get from one to another, there's some fairly key decisions that need to be made as to the basic characteristics of the corridor. Starting out, if you're not an existing route, an existing corridor, and if you are a new corridor where there may be several routes available, either parallel existing rail lines or a potential new rail line, you need to decide what route you're going to take. You're also going to need to determine the characteristics of the service you're going to operate. What are the frequencies? What are the trip times? What's the capacity of the trains? What are the fares and the fare policy? Really trying to capture in those service characteristics, in those service options, all of the factors that come into play when travelers decide how they're going to travel, all the factors, at least that are defined by the intercity passenger rail service. And you're also going to be looking at investments, that is the list of capital projects necessary to implement the corridor, improve the corridor with a given set of service characteristics on a given route. And for those of you who may have seen some of our presentations over the last several years, or have been actively working with us over the last few years in developing passenger rail services, you'll probably recognize these as three of the components of alternatives analysis for railroad capital projects as we've laid them out. But those decisions require a lot of input in order to make sound and defensible decisions. Starting off, you have the really nitty-gritty transportation planning inputs, travel demand forecasting, operations analysis, all these different things that help define all of those different decisions around route, service, and investments that you make as part of the alternatives analysis. But you're not just taking that into account, you're also looking at factors like high-level environmental analysis and input and involvement by the members of the public and by other public agencies that may have a stake in the development of this corridor, all of which really falls under the environmental umbrella. And we feed those into this process as well, into the alternatives analysis and into the preparation of the service development plan, because the intent here is for the conclusions and analysis done in preparing the service development plan to feed as seamlessly as possible into subsequent formal environmental review under NEPA. But then we also have a third category of inputs that really have to do with how the service would be implemented: financial planning, governance, benefit cost analysis, and implementation phasing, all of which fall under the umbrella of implementation planning. So it's really the project planning, the environmental, feeding the alternatives analysis, feeding into the service development plan with an additional input of this implementation planning piece that doesn't necessarily affect as directly the decision-making during alternatives analysis, but still is an absolutely essential component of getting the corridor ready for implementation. And those of you with a very sharp eye and who really have closely followed some of our presentations at various conferences and webinars and videos and whatnot, or have worked with us previously, might notice that there is one element of railroad capital project alternatives that's missing here. That is the look at design options for individual capital investments. That is something that really happens during the project development phase, the PE-NEPA phase of the project lifecycle, rather than in the project planning phase, which really coincides with the preparation of the service development plan. So that would be a subsequent step looked at as part of step 3 under the corridor identification development program. So this is a huge amount, we know, and not all of this is going to be required for every corridor. Looking at something that might be very simple, like a program to improve all the stations on an existing corridor. This is one I like to point out. I like to joke with our friends from North Carolina that when I first started in this, the state of North Carolina was embarking on a very ambitious program for station improvements that they got a huge amount of traction out of. And it's the kind of thing that is on the kind of lower end of the spectrum of what could be selected for corridor ID going forward. But not all these things that we've looked at, these elements of developing a service development plan, are relevant to a project or a corridor proposal with that scope. you're not going to be looking at route options. You've got a service, you know where the stations are, that's a done deal. That'll just be defined in the purpose and need. You aren't going to really be looking at service options. You're not changing the service. You just want to improve the stations that passengers go through on each end of their trip. So that ends up dropping off. And really, even investments options ends up dropping out of the alternatives analysis. You know what the projects are. They are improvements to existing stations. So that drops out as well. Then in terms of the project planning work, several things drop out too. So, you look at the operations analysis, you're not going to be changing your timetable. You're not really going to be looking at operations analysis. Stations and access planning is going to be a big piece of the puzzle though. Fleet planning drops out. Again, you're not changing your operation. You're going to have some conceptual engineering, particularly as it relates to identifying the design requirements for these station improvements, what facilities you want to provide, what the capacity of those facilities are. You may have a little bit of labor planning, but it's not likely to be a huge element of it unless you're going to be changing your staffing fairly significantly at stations. And the same kind of goes with operating and maintenance costs. On the environmental side, you're still going to be looking at all three of these elements, but at a fairly low level of effort, and similarly on implementation planning. So again, for that more modest type of proposal for a corridor that could be selected into the program, we're looking at a much more modest level of effort for preparing a service development plan. But if you step things up one to kind of an intermediate level of effort, say you're looking to increase the frequency of service on an existing corridor, some of these things are going to start popping back in. So you're going to be looking at service options. How many frequencies are you talking about? What the timetable is going to look like, what the trip times may be, because that may be in part a function of the frequency that you're running. And you're certainly going to be looking at investment options of what investments you may need to make in order to support that increase in frequency, whether or not that's in terms of line haul capacity improvements or other types of projects. On the transportation planning side of things, you're certainly going to be looking at travel demand forecasting. The reason that you're hopefully increasing frequencies is that you want to grow your demand. You're going to have operations analysis come back into play. Station and access planning might actually not be a major component of this if you have good stations as it stands right now with adequate capacity to fulfill the needs of any additional ridership that you're anticipating would result from the frequency increase. You will have fleet planning come back in though. Your equipment turns are going to change. Your fleet needs in terms of the amount of equipment you need may change. So that comes back into play. And again, for all the other remaining elements here, you may have a bit of a step up in the level of effort from what you'd be looking at that station improvement example that I gave earlier, but they still are all certainly part of the mix here. And then, you can look at the very high end of level of effort, developing a new corridor on an entirely new rail line where you have route options come back into play. If you're talking about an entirely new service, you may know the key geographic markets it's intended to serve, which would be reflected in your purpose and needs statement, but there may be several different ways available to connect those, serving different intermediate markets. So you're going to be looking at route options as part of developing the service development plan. You're going to be looking at service as well, investments, and then in terms of project planning, everything ends up coming into play there at a fairly high level of effort. And the same is true of the environmental and the implementation planning inputs into the service development plan. But not every proposal is going to require this very high level of effort. And we are going to be making every effort possible to make sure that we tailor the level of effort for each service development plan that's prepared or updated for each selected corridor based on the real characteristics of the corridor that has been selected and the scope of improvement that's anticipated, and taking into account the work that's been done to date by the corridor sponsor.
Okay, so one of the other items we're working very hard on here is to have a standard statement of work framework for when you enter into step 2. So I'll back up and talk a bit about step one, corridors selected into the program will receive, our intent today is to have a standard step one statement of work. I think Peter might touch on this a little bit more at the end when we answer a number of the questions we've already received. So what I'm describing here is after you've completed step one, and we have all agreed on the scope, schedule, and budget to actually perform your service development plan, we anticipate that statement of work having the same type of tasks across all of our service development planning efforts. So what does that look like? Task one will be project administration. Task two will be those elements that Peter described under the purpose and need and stakeholder engagement. So those activities related to purpose and need and stakeholder engagement. Task 3, 4, and 5 are those very technical aspects of what we do, the alternatives analysis, the transportation technical analysis, and the preliminary environmental analysis. And Peter mentioned this earlier, but we do see those three tasks as being iterative and building upon one another. They will be done concurrently throughout the service development planning process. And these are the types of aspects that fall into, this is just flowing down from Peter's previous slide of the type of activities that would exist within those tasks.
Sadly, when we do this online, you're not able to see the nifty animations that we gave at the Court Washington meeting where all those boxes just magically show up under these tasks. But hopefully this gives the gist of things.
So task 6 is the, how are we going to pay for it and what do we get out of the investment? Task 7, who's in charge of what? How is this project going to be governed? And then financial planning, benefit cost analysis, governance. Those are the activities that fall under these tasks. And then finally, task 8 is the service development plan itself, the final packaging of all of these activities. And then how they would be, if phased, how they'd be implemented over a phasing timeline. So did we have questions? Okay, so we're going to turn it over to Jenny now to talk a little bit about how to apply, and then we'll be back to answer some questions at the end.
Great, thank you, Wen Peter. I'm Jenny Zing, and as mentioned, I'm just going to cover a few basic logistics on the notice of solicitation and funding opportunity, and make sure you kind of have the tools you need for how to apply. So starting from basics, what is a NOFO, which is the notice of solicitation or funding opportunity? Here we're calling it a NOFO to, it really announces the grant opportunity and contains details about the application requirements and procedures to request federal funding for eligible projects. In terms of what is actually in the NOFO, there are a few key parts that are pretty standard across FRA programs, especially. As you'll see, and Peter will go into even further detail later, there will be a program summary covering key dates, including required documents that you'll need to submit, helpful addresses, as well as FRA contact information. And the table of contents in the NOFO also covers eligibility information for applicants and what sort of applicants are eligible to apply and what sort of corridors are eligible for consideration. We'll have the application and submission information in the NOFO, as well as application review information and how the federal award will be administered. So how do you start? We suggest first checking the FRA webpage. If you click on the link at the bottom of the page to access the NOFO, you'll be able to directly see the NOFO for the Corridor ID program. And this link should be also available in your web links section as well. So specifically for this program, you'll notice that there are 2 Federal Register publications related to it. Please note that the first one on the left side is the actual NOFO that we are talking about. And highlighted there in kind of the red box is the assistance listing number, which we'll talk about very soon in the next slide as well. The second publication on the right is actually just a small amendment to extend the deadline so that applications are now due at 5 p.m. on March 27th. So just to keep those two pieces in mind. So to figure out and actually see the how to apply information, please search the grant on grants.gov. In that keyword box in the red highlight box there as well, that's where you'll want to pop in that grants kind of number that we saw in the first NOFO. You can also search corridor identification, and this first result should pop up for you. So you'll see the opportunity number for the FY22 Corridor ID Grant Program. If you click into that, you'll get a lot of information that will be helpful, including some summary info in the synopsis section that kind of lays out the highlights for you. And there are a few things to keep in mind as well as you're preparing your application that we want to highlight. So the first is please obtain a unique entity identifier, or UEI. You'll want to register early in the federal government system for awards management, or SAM as we call it. We've heard from some applicants that SAM registration, if you need to do this, can take up to 4 weeks or even longer if you don't have that employer identification number. So please get started on that on the sooner side. Additionally, for grants.gov, you'll want to complete an authorized organization representative profile, including the username, password, all that good stuff as well. And then you will finally submit an application addressing all the requirements outlined in the NOFO. Peter will walk you through kind of this in more detail very soon, but in terms of what you'll need to include, that is the corridor narrative section of the NOFO, which we have a small screenshot of to the right. And as well as a few other forms will be required. So those are the SF424, or application for federal assistance. It includes the SF424A, SF424B, as well as the FRA F30 document for additional assurances and certifications, the FRA F251 document for sort of to discuss a financial capability, and the SFLLL, which is a disclosure of lobbying activities if necessary for you.
And Jenny, it might be a good
Yes.
time to address actually one of the questions that we got from a couple of folks prior to the webinar, which is, what does the budget look like for this? Like, what are folks applying for in responding to the solicitation and NOFO from a funding perspective? The award that folks would be applying for here would be that $500,000 in 100% federal seed money to complete step one of the Corridor ID program. So in terms of your SF424A, the budget really should be, unless you think it's going to take you more than $500,000, but we think that that is in almost all cases likely a generous amount to complete that. Your budget would be for $500,000 broken out by the categories that you think your costs would fall into in preparing a statement of work, for preparing a service development plan, for preparing a cost estimate for completing a service development plan, and for building out your own capacity as a grantee and as a corridor sponsor for supporting the development of the corridor within the program. So I just wanted to address that right off the bat, since this seems like a good point in the presentation to kind of touch on that.
Definitely.
Back to you, Jenny.
Oh, no, thank you, Peter. Good addition. So please keep that in mind as Peter was discussing. And I just shifting a little bit more. So if you do need additional information and help about the grant opportunity, there is a link here to additional information when you search the Corridor ID program in grants.gov. Another quick thing here is to discuss and to kind of walk you through the general process that we go through with applications. There are 4 kind of large steps here, the first being intake and eligibility. We will review each application received for completeness and eligibility. And those that are deemed both complete and eligible will move on to evaluation. So a panel of DOT subject matter experts will use the criteria outlined in the NOFO to evaluate the kind of merits of the application. Then step 3, selection. So final decisions are made, of course, by taking into account the criteria outlined in the NOFO. And then about 6 months following the application due date, we'll have the FRA press release announcing selections. In case it's helpful, we also have this FRA competitive grants application process that you can look at the link here. So a few helpful hints as you're taking this all in. Please read the NOFO completely and carefully. It really lays out everything you need to understand for criteria regarding eligibility and selection and what we need to see in your application. Provide a clear project title that tells us who you are and what the project is about. And finally, best practices in terms of the corridor narrative. I think this is where maybe I will pass things on to Peter again.
No, thanks so much, Jenny. Yeah, so the corridor narrative really is the heart of the application, and it is limited for corridor ID to 15 pages. That's largely due to the fact that, as I mentioned before, there is a place in the corridor ID program for promising intercity passenger rail services, regardless of how thoroughly developed they are. So we wanted to make sure that we tried to keep things fairly concise, really hitting on the most important issues that will support a decision of whether or not to select a corridor. And while you're certainly welcome, if you're an existing corridor or have done a lot of development work that you're looking to essentially fold into corridor ID, to address that fairly briefly in your corridor narrative, we're not looking for a huge flood of technical information and whatnot necessarily to come in. As well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the thrust of this program is about comprehensive development of intercity passenger rail services with a really kind of strategic orientation. So we are not looking at, nor is it eligible for us to consider proposals that just relate to a single capital project or something like that. We're looking for something, frankly, a bit more long-term, forward-looking, and a bit more comprehensive. So please keep that in mind, both as you consider whether or not what's on your mind is appropriate for an application, but also as you, if you believe that it is, as you put together the corridor narrative. In terms of the elements here, please structure the corridor narrative in accordance with the outline specified in the NOFO. It's reflected here on this slide, but there's quite a bit more detail in the NOFO itself. Include all the elements identified in the outline. Follow the instructions for each element, and again, adhere to that 15-page page limit. Anything beyond that, we frankly are not going to be able to look at. You may have additional documentation that you want to append as appendices or attachments to your grant application. You're certainly free to do so, but be aware that it is this 15-page corridor narrative that will really be the focus of FRA as we evaluate the applications we receive and subsequently move forward with selecting corridors for the program. In terms of the individual elements, there's a cover page that we ask for and provide in the NOFO a format for a table to capture certain kind of basic information on the proposal. We do ask that you include that table on the cover page and follow it as closely as possible. We then get into a corridor summary, which is a brief description, 4 to 6 sentences, of the challenges the corridor aims to address and the intended outcomes of the development of that corridor, whether or not it's a new corridor or an improvement to an existing corridor. And really think of this as that elevator pitch. If you had 5 minutes in front of FRA to make your case, put it there in that corridor summary. Corridor funding is, a little bit of a tricky thing to address here because, of course, for the Step 1 award, there is no need for there to be a non-federal share. That non-federal share kicks in with Step 2 with a 10% non-federal share for preparing or updating a service development plan, and then stepping up to a 20% non-federal share for Step 3, that is preliminary engineering and NEPA under project development. But we do want to get an idea in this corridor funding section of your certainty or comfort that you will have that funding available to move the corridor through the entire process of the Corridor ID program. You don't need to have it all set up, but if you have funding sources that are eligible to be used for planning passenger rail services, certainly say that. And honestly, if you have some real challenges that may arise to get those non-federal shares, please be upfront with that in this corridor funding section. We know that there are a lot of folks out there where coming up with non-federal share may be a fairly significant challenge, but that is not necessarily a cut and dry impediment to a corridor facing those challenges from being selected into the program. Likewise, in these checked boxes on the right side of the slide, there's several types of just kind of boilerplate type of questions that we have about funding that you should be addressed in this section as well. You'll want to address your eligibility as an applicant. On the right side of the slide here lists the eligible entities to apply for Corridor ID, which we've liked to describe as pretty much any kind of public entity you can think of that has a role in surface transportation or certainly railroad transportation. They are all public entities, or Amtrak kind of straddling the line there. We've had a question about what to do where there may be a group of states or a combination of several types of, or even multiple of a single type of eligible entity that wants to apply, like a group of regional planning organizations or a group of political subdivisions of a state. And what we ask is that you essentially designate a lead applicant, which will be the entity that submits the application. But you can describe in the applicant eligibility section and elsewhere in the corridor narrative what the relationships are between that lead entity and the other eligible entities that may also, be backing this proposal that's been submitted. We aren't looking necessarily for, ironclad agreements to be in place between all those entities at the time of application, but we are looking to get an idea of who is at play here, who's backing it. We're going to see the lead applicant because they're going to be the ones who press the button on grants.gov. But, we want to make sure that we capture everybody else and have some evidence, which could be in the form of letters of support that are included as attachments of the other eligible entities that have an interest in the proposal. Next, we have a detailed corridor description. Please take a look at the NOFO. It has 10 elements that are requested there that should be addressed very clearly and in order. We asked for information on the corridor location, geospatial data, which could be, if it's an existing route, a shapefile of the route pulled from, say, the North American Rail Network GIS layer that FRA maintains. But we know as well that for some corridors, they may only be defined at this point by a list of key geographic markets that the corridor would serve. And if you want to provide lat longs of those markets, that would be sufficient as well for fulfilling that geospatial data request. Where you'd also be looking for a map of the corridor and the congressional districts that the corridor may traverse. And if there may be some uncertainty about that, you're free to indicate that in the corridor location section to the extent that the possible routes may go through differing congressional districts. We're then looking for a separate section that focuses on how the proposal addresses and meets the evaluation and selection criteria. We ask you to do so in kind of a self-contained fashion, so don't rely on the contents of your corridor description or other elements of the corridor narrative to address each one of those evaluation selection criteria. If you got to repeat it, go ahead and repeat it. We're really looking to make sure that that section 7 here, is fairly self-contained. And, try to quantify the benefits where possible. Now, one question that we've gotten a lot throughout this process, really since the BIL was enacted, has come around the fact that a lot of the statutory evaluation selection criteria, you'd only be able to essentially assess a corridor against that if you had information that actually is supposed to be developed as part of preparing a service development plan. So we get into kind of a chicken and the egg type of situation here. Some of that information may be more readily available, for instance, if it's an existing service or where it's a corridor that has been subject to previous development efforts. But we don't want to in any way unduly burden proposals that are for corridors that are just at their very earliest stage of planning and development. So if you have information, whether qualitative or quantitative, to address those kind of chicken and egg criteria that are there, certainly include it. But it's also fair to say, hey, listen, you want a ridership forecast. We've just identified this corridor. We think that there's a lot of potential here. We can give you the population of the markets that it would certainly serve that kind of define the corridor, but we don't have a demand forecast right now. That's a perfectly acceptable answer to that particular evaluation criteria. So lastly, we have a section for you to address some of the DOT strategic goals that will come into play in the selection of corridors into the program. Things like climate change, sustainability impacts, improved equity, reducing barriers to opportunity. So, describe in this section how the development and implementation of your corridor would support and further those strategic goals of the overall department. And likewise, provide information which, given where we are with in the life cycle when we're talking about these planning phases, these development phases, if you have information on strong labor standards, please include that as well. But it's obviously something that is much more applicable to our construction-oriented programs than a planning and development-oriented program like Corridor ID. So, in terms of recaps and reminders, again, just before we round things off, read that NOFO carefully. I don't say that because I wrote a lot of it. I'm just saying read through it because that charts your path for putting together as strong an application as possible. Address all of those evaluation selection criteria very, very directly. Don't bury things. Don't cross-reference. Just hit it home as hard as you can right there on a point-by-point basis. So from there, we've been doing questions. Here, again, are those two email addresses. One for kind of the basic procedural stuff, fra-nofo-support@dot.gov. And for more of the substantive questions about Corridor ID, paxraildev@dot.gov. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Hope we were able to provide some useful information, and we're really looking forward to seeing all of your applications in 6 or whatever it is, 5-6 weeks. It's coming on us quick. So I know you all are hard at work, and we look forward to seeing those.
Thank you, guys. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the Corridor Identification and Development Program Notice of Solicitation and Funding Opportunity webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be available on FRA's website in the next week. The webinar will end in 20 seconds. Please copy or screenshot the contact information on the screen. Please note we will email all web links to you after the event. This information has ended. Thank you so much for joining us today.